Hello students, this video is going to cover some common writing errors that you might face as you're trying to revise your papers. Often when I am giving students feedback, I see these three main errors that we're going to go over in this presentation. All right, so the first one is your headings. You'll often have questions about APA headings and how do I know how many to use and how do I know which ones to use? Well, this is a little guide for you. You'll notice that all of them should start with level 1 headings. That means everybody has level 1 headings in their paper as long as you're writing more than a few pages. And if I decide that this level 1 heading for a section of my paper, it's got a topic and I'm covering something, it gets really long and detailed. In fact, it's got a couple different points in there. I might decide to divide it up even further and create some level 2 headings within that level 1 section. And if one of those sections gets really long and detailed, I want to divide it up even further, then I go to level 3 and so on. This means that you'll never have a level 5 heading just sitting out there by itself randomly. They are always part of a section that comes prior. So if I have a level 5 heading, it's part of a section prior to that, which is a level 4 heading. And that level 4 heading would be part of a section that was prior, which would be a level 3 heading, and so on. So that means that for many of you, you may have only level 1 headings in your paper, and that's totally fine. You might have a couple level 2s if you have some longer sections, and a few of you might decide to go to level 3. In this sort of a paper that you're probably doing in my class, it's very unlikely you'll need to go to 4 or 5. You can choose to if you decide you have a really long section, but most of the time you'll see something like that in a master's thesis or a dissertation, something that has a lot of data to cover in a very detailed sections. And so you can see this example here. I may have some level 1 headings for each of my main points I'm going to make. In that section, I might decide that I need a level 2. And if that section gets too long and complicated and I need to divide it up further, maybe I want to label something and point it out, I'll give it a level 3. Notice that they do not need to be symmetrical. You might have some sections that have level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you might have some sections that are just a level 1, and that's totally fine. They don't need to match, so there's no need to try and make some kind of symmetry out of that organization of your paper. Think of it as an outline. When you're making your outline, you have several points you're going to make, and you might have some subpoints or subtopics you're going to cover, and each of those would get a corresponding heading by level. Okay? The next thing we're going to talk about that is a very common mistake is citations. And the first one, these in-text citations, this is one I see a lot where people will list the author's entire name, and they might also list the whole title of the text that they're citing. You don't need to do that. In APA, we only cite the author's last name and the year it was written. If you're quoting something specific, then you'll use a page number as this person did. This is a real student example from a previous semester. So you can see that this person was trying to be really specific in introducing the text, but it actually takes a lot of time to get through all this when they could have just used the author's last name and the year, and that was it. They didn't need to go and fill up that much space with that kind of detail. Okay, the other example of in-text citations are presented here. These are 3 positive ways of doing it. And these are all pulled from that Purdue website that you're probably all familiar with by now. So you'll notice that here we can have an introductory phrase like according to Jones, and then you always want to have the year. Think of the name and the year as being connected. They're always next to each other. Okay, if I put an author's last name, the year should always be next to it in parentheses. Then if I have a quote, then at the end, I'm going to always include a page number, right? Down here, they decided to write it a little differently, but you can see it's the same idea. They put the author's name, the year, and then this person put Jones in 1998, found, and then put their quote. And then they had a page number. But notice something interesting they did here was that they added a comment to the statement, which is something you can definitely do and should think about in your paper. There's another way of doing it down here. These are all good examples. So you can take a look at these and kind of model your sentences after these examples if you're trying to figure out how to properly quote someone. And you want to make sure that those 3 elements are always there when you're citing someone, especially if you have a direct citation. The next thing to think about is potentially not quoting someone word for word and doing a paraphrase instead, especially if I have a lot of information that's just really detailed and you start to feel like it becomes a little bit cumbersome to quote it. If you have those really long block quotes and you've got a lot of them, then you might want to paraphrase instead. And so if you're doing that, here's a good example. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can pause and look at this example of the original passage here, and then a good paraphrase that is an example of how to do that. Notice that we're still going to put the author's name and the year, even if it's a paraphrase, because we still want to give that person credit for their work. All right. Here's the next thing that is always a challenge when we have these tricky citations. First of all, when possible, you're always going to want to use the original text that's being talked about. If you can go find it, that would be ideal. Add that to your reference list. If it's just a small idea and it's something you're just mentioning briefly, you don't feel the need to go read a whole other article or book, then I understand that. That's okay. You can cite it if it's something that's in another text, and that becomes pretty tricky. So here's an example of how to do that down here. So let's say we have something that we read, and we read something by Smith, but Smith is talking about something Johnson said, right? So here's this kind of silly example I made down here with the blah, blah, blah. But notice this is in Smith's article. They cited Johnson, and I want to use this, all right? So if I do, then I have to do something like this. Johnson, 1999, argued that, and then in parentheses at the end, I'm going to put as cited in Smith, 2003, page 102, because I want to show credit for both authors. I want to show where I got it, but I also don't want to act like this was Smith's idea because Smith got it from Johnson. So I want to include both of them in there, okay? So we talked about headings, we talked about citations. Those are two common mistakes a lot of people make. Now we're getting to the more difficult ones, which is awkward phrasing. A lot of times we have something that we read and we go to try and revise our work and we read something and think, that just doesn't sound right. And I don't know what to do about it, but it doesn't sound right. So these are probably some of those kinds of things that you're going to see here. Now this one is a real student example. This is from a rough draft. So you can see it's a little, it needs some work, which is okay. There are actually some misspelled words here. That's what I've highlighted in pink, but the yellow are things that are just sort of not quite right. They're not necessarily breaking rules. They just need some revision, right? So it's always best to avoid first person. You see this writer here put, in the research that I have done, most experts say that full inclusion of all special needs students in a general education classroom is the most ideal learning method for any school, but can be very difficult to implement at any school, especially elementary schools. So you can kind of hear that that sounds kind of repetitive. It sounds a little bit cumbersome to read, right? It's a little bit awkward. And here's an example of how you could revise something like that and simplify it. Research indicates that inclusion of students with special needs in general education classrooms are ideal, but can be difficult to implement, especially in elementary schools. Notice it's the same idea that we had up here, but we have a lot of repetition that didn't need to take place. And we were able to get rid of this first person I, which we want to try to avoid. It's not against the rules in APA to use I. However, it's best to be consistent with a third person and not really say the word I, me, we, anything like that when we're talking about the work you've been doing. All right, here's another example. You want to look for these kinds of traits like wordiness and repetition. Now, this example also has a sentence fragment, and I wanted to point this out to you because this is a very long sentence, but it's still a fragment. Okay, so consider that and think to yourself, does everything I'm reading have a clear subject and predicate? And if you're struggling with that, don't worry, you're not alone. A lot of people do, but you'll have to maybe do a little more research on reviewing that kind of stuff. Here's an example of that repetition we were talking about, though. It could be very simple words like into and into, and those are not bad to use over and over, but when they're right next to each other in a sentence, it can sound a little bit strange. This research paper went into detail looking into different aspects of equity. So it's a little wordy as well. You can see that's what I labeled here in this next part of the sentence, and to see what actions are being made to make schools and communities more equitable. So we have a lot of repetition, and it seems like it's a very long, wordy sentence for a pretty simple idea. So I didn't put a revised one, but I'd challenge you to think about that. If you have sentences like this that seem pretty long and wordy, how can you simplify it? Can you say it in a shorter sentence? Can you say it a little more directly? It's always better to go with a simpler version if possible. All right, the next one, again, we have another first person. Notice that this writer tried to start without using it and then kind of slipped back into it by accident here using we. Don't forget, we is also first person. And the main issue with this example is informality. They went from being very formal to informal. There are a lot of kinds of writing and genres where informal is fine. You're doing a journal response or a reflection or a quick write. Those make sense. If you're writing a research paper, particularly in APA, it needs to be formal all the way through, and it needs to have an academic kind of tone, right? So we can see that this person started that way and then kind of shifts over here in this part that I highlighted yellow. And they shifted over to this other tone and it sounds like this. Not saying that every student in a teacher's class is going to have some life-shaping experiences, but there are definitely more in the class than one would think. So starting like this sounds fine when we're talking out loud, right? But once we write it, it sounds pretty informal. So we could think of a way to revise this sentence that would maybe change that beginning part and get a little more direct to our point. All right, those are some examples that hopefully will help you in looking through your own paper and making revisions. Please let me know if you need more help in the future.